Hello, good morning. Thank you for inviting me. I was at PLNOG in 2009, and it is good to be back. I'm going to speak to you today about some controversial topics about information sharing. Information sharing is almost always in the news. There's always some government agency or treaty or perhaps a nonprofit or an NGO that is trying to facilitate greater sharing of threats and threat intelligence among the Internet's many victims. And I think that's a good topic, but it is not my topic today. I have something related that is a little bit more controversial than that. So first let me say that I am not opposed to commercial competition in the security field. It is an inevitable and I think healthy part of human nature to want to be the best, to want to achieve the most. And in particular, companies that don't work for their own profit will often fail, which means that it is not a sustainable activity. It does you no good to behave in a way that you go into bankruptcy and your assets are then acquired by competitors who paid more respect to profit than you did. Nations also are capable of failing, or at least empires are capable of failing if they do not preserve their own influence. So again, I understand competition, and I am not opposed to it. But for that competition to be constructive, in other words, ultimately beneficial, sustainable, able to be a historical foundation on which the future can be constructed, a couple of constructive norms must be observed. In particular, the rule of law is important when you're a nation. Recognition of rights, more so perhaps, not just by nations, but by companies. And of course, in terms of Internet standards, if you compete by being incompatible, then you will lose. So there's a certain amount of standardization that must be observed within the context of competition. And all I mean to point out is that there's an important balance between cooperation, even with your competitors, and successful competition. And that leads to an interesting relationship between what is good for everybody and what is good for each party. I'm not going to go into the game theory of this, but I expect a lot of you have studied the classic prisoner's dilemma, some of which applies here. So you can, and you've seen in history that humanity often does, mandate various kinds of cooperation. And yet, if you have a mandate that is unenforceable, you will ultimately lose credibility and achieve nothing good. And so it's important in the Internet to remember that you cannot universally mandate other people's behavior in the way that you could, let's say, in the physical world, where you might be a nation who controls your own borders, you have a military, you can require or prohibit certain activities successfully. Not on the Internet. Censorship on the Internet is famously treated as damage and is simply worked around by the people who wanted to do the thing that you wanted to prohibit. This means that practicality is also an important constraint of sustainable competition and sustainable mandates, laws. So there are many examples of non-cooperation. For example, spam. I don't like receiving most of the email that I receive, and I expect that the same is true of you, unless you have very good spam filters. But the people who want to send me that spam have some unilateral benefit in mind. They want advertising clicks, they want something, and they can get it by sending me email that I more or less have to receive before I can decide whether to filter it. So my Internet connectivity, in that case, is being used against my will by someone who is perhaps cooperating at the low-level protocol level. In other words, they're speaking the correct email protocol in order to transmit the message, but they're not cooperating with me as the owner of my inbox. And again, you can have whatever laws, treaties, norms you want, but if somebody wants to use the internet in some way, even if it also involves you, you probably don't have as many choices as you would like. So again, practicality is going to rule our lived experience. Before the internet, crime usually had a place. It would take place somewhere. With the internet, that has changed. I remember in the 1960s, a small child growing up in San Francisco, that I would occasionally hear about some senior citizen being mugged, accosted, have the purse snatched when they were on their way back from the bank on Social Security Day. And that was, of course, a bad thing. That's not something anyone would look forward to or be happy about. But what I want to point out is that at that time, the internet didn't exist. So if you wanted to steal that senior citizen's money, you had to put yourself in the same place that they were. And there were many risks. Once your body is at the scene of the crime, then you as a criminal might face the risk of later identification. You might be seen by police. You might trip while running away, break your leg. There are all kinds of risks that occurred for criminals in the 60s and 70s and even in the early 80s that don't occur now. Any given senior citizen is at far larger risk. They have a much greater attack surface now because any potential mugger, any criminal who's interested in their bank account can find a way to, I don't know, infect their browser with some drive-by malware. They can do all kinds of terrible things to steal the same money, but with no risk to themselves. And so what I have noted about that is that the internet means that crime no longer has a place where it occurs. It is essentially occurring on planet Earth, but that's about as specific as you can get in terms of how you would defend yourself against it. That's a big change, and I'm not certain that we have adapted our laws, treaties, or norms to account for that change. So I'm in favor of information sharing in general and of internet threat data in particular, because if one of us is attacked and we keep that information a secret, inevitably someone else will be attacked by the same actor, and the actor will gain strength from our silence. This improves the business conditions of your adversary, which is usually the opposite of your best interests. You will not be safer than the rest of the people on the internet. You might have a little bit of temporary safety, but in the long run, any threat that we don't work collectively to stop is going to get around all of us eventually. So there's a certain loss of prestige in admitting that you've been attacked, especially if you're, let's say, a national intelligence community, but that loss of prestige is small compared to the loss of advantage, again, if you don't share this information. And as you begin sharing this information, you'll run into things like GDPR, which is coming soon, or national privacy law in general, which has been going on for as long as there's been an internet, or perhaps longer. And collecting personally identifiable information is probably worth avoiding when you're sharing threat information, because it won't do you good to make yourself safer or to make your partners safer if you've made your customers less safe by violating their privacy. So there is a balance even in this fairly obvious use case. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I want to say that the headlines today, this year, are full of nation-state attacks. This is nations seeking advantage against other nations by using what they call cyberspace. And that's kind of out of scope for me. If a nation state wants to attack you, they probably have more resources than you do. I'm not saying you should just give up, but I am saying that sharing threat information about that may not be as effective as sharing threat information about commercial actors, normal private criminals. So anything that nations are doing is completely out of scope for me. So I want to talk about information sharing that is not threat, right? Sharing your threats, sharing the results of an attack, maybe sharing the malware signatures or even the malware itself after you've been successfully breached can really help you. But there's another type of information sharing that I think we need to practice more broadly, and that is non-threat related. In other words, what is the background hum of our networks and our systems? What do they do most of the time in between attacks? And the reason this is important is that there is no complete or authoritative map of the internet, and there won't be. The internet changes every second. There's always something being added or subtracted, something going up, something coming down. And so it's never possible to get a complete view of your adversary's capabilities or previous activities. So if you want to have that, then you're going to have to be able to watch the entire internet when it's not being attacked, so that you can build up your own corpus of information and history and relationships, so that when there is an attack, you have some hope of knowing what the context of the attacker was. What is their asset cloud? So in 2007, I was running a nonprofit company, Internet Systems Consortium, which you might know is the source of some software called Bind. And I decided to launch a security information exchange that was for precisely the purpose of sharing moment-by-moment telemetry about how the internet is being used without regard to threats. There's no filtering at all. There's nothing that says, nothing in the software, nothing in the design that says that we only share information about the successful attacks or even the unsuccessful attacks. I know there are plenty of things like DShield and so on that'll share syslogs and firewall logs, and I get all that, and I think that's fine. But that does not help me understand the internet as a whole, which is the foundation the bad guys are standing on when they attack me. So the idea here was to put sensors everywhere in the world with a hub and spoke model, so we would centralize the information, backhaul it all to a sharing exchange, which was at that time in California, but is now somewhat more distributed, and have it be that anyone who could do good with that information, whether they were private, academic, commercial, government, whatever, if there was good that could be done, then that data would be made available. Now, I do want to say we all have bills to pay, so the commercial operators always had to pay for access to this information. The academics who don't have any money have never had to pay. And this was quite successful. We became a global network, and in 2013, I moved all of this activity out of that nonprofit company into my current employer, Farsight Security, which operates under the same principles. In other words, academic and sort of internet volunteers still don't pay because that's a benefit that our sensor operators get from us, is that their data will be better studied if they share it with us. Their networks will be better studied. Any crime that takes place on their networks will be better studied if they run our sensor. So things are bigger now. We've grown by a factor of 8 in almost every metric. And we still don't collect personally identifiable information. I've been fascinated to watch the other companies in California who are in the security industry freak out about GDPR because they don't know, what it means to them. But we have always been legal in Germany, which is even stricter than GDPR in terms of PII collection. We've always been legal in China, Russia, Japan, all of whom look at GDPR as a small subset of what needs to be done. So we're pretty much already in a position where no end user privacy is ever violated by our operations. There are some unfortunate exceptions, but we monitor for those and work diligently to keep them out. This is the general structure of what we do, and if you are even a moderate expert at DNS, you will see that the PII in DNS occurs between your stub resolver, which might be this phone, and the server that is provided to it by Wi-Fi for DNS lookups, right? That server knows my IP address, and from that you can get my MAC address, and from that you can get my personal identity. So the indication of personally identifiable information between the bottom and middle clouds here is real. But above that cloud, if you ask your local Wi-Fi server a question it doesn't know and it has to go find it for you, that's not exposing your personal IP address. That's a server IP address, because it does not have to expose anything about who its client is when it is hunting that information. So that's where we collect the data, and we backhaul it, and we build a number of products. We make it available to analysts. None of this is particularly important to the story about information sharing. So let me talk about SAE Europe. This is an historic moment. I have come from Karlsruhe last week, where we signed the papers that incorporated a company in Europe in order to gather this information. It's a non-profit company owned by three of us, myself, a man named Christoph Fischer, who runs the security company BFK, and a man named Peter Cruz, who runs a security company called CSIS in Denmark. The purpose of this company is to gather this same information, but only within Europe, and to share it only within Europe. And the reason for this is that a lot of lawyers, especially lawyers working at universities, have decided that they don't agree with my interpretation of the GDPR, and they're terrified of sending information that might identify their students, their customers, their visitors with a company in California. So we decided to create a local sharing exchange that was inside the GDPR perimeter. And what we plan to do is move all of our sensor feeds that currently go to California from Europe to go to this company instead. And it will make the data available in real time or in stored form, depending on what people ask for, to the people who participate. So that would mean that your benefit, if you decided when you were operating your network, you decided you wanted to run a sensor, clearly it would have to be more significant than a sensor on your laptop or in your house. We appreciate small feeds, but we need significant feeds. But if you're an operator of some network and you run sensors and you feed this fabric, you will get a copy of everything that is on the channel you contributed to. So you give a little, you get a lot. There's no money. I wanted to make it so that Europe would be very well studied within Europe. I would like it to be that when people are committing crimes in Europe, they are leaving a trail of breadcrumbs that connects all of their assets. So, there is a commercial element for me. We will ultimately anonymize this information sufficiently to protect the owners of this nonprofit company, and then that and only that will be exported to California so that I can use the completely anonymized summary data about Europe in my other global products. So that was my reason for doing all of this. There are various restrictions on what people can do with the data. We certainly don't want anyone to get it from us and then redistribute it. And most of the reason for that is that we have to control the total distribution, or we are not protecting our sensor operators and privacy, or their customers or students' privacy. So there will be some things that you can't do, like start a company to commercialize this data and then shift all of your data collection costs onto this nonprofit. That's not going to work. And we're going to make sure that there are lawyers to enforce that, since I think I mentioned if you don't enforce something, you just lose credibility. So this was launched now, and we are beginning a period of testing in April with the various equipment that it takes. All of the sensor software that a participant might need is open source. I'm not asking anyone to run software that they cannot look at and audit for their own safety. And dare I say again, this is a real-time exchange. Crime is now placeless, and so it must become timeful. We have to see the data when it happens. So there's a tradition in the internet of gathering information, let's say with PCAP or BPF, TCP dump, that sort of thing. There's a tradition of gathering information using these tools and putting the results into files. And then at the end of some period, like an hour or a day, you would close that file and start a new one, and then you would take the old file and share it. But I think the math should be clear to everyone. If you are building hour-long batch files, then by the time you get around to sharing that data, the data in it will be an average of 30 minutes old, by which time many of the crimes that are floating through the background telemetry that you're sharing will be complete. It's very important that we keep things in the now. So what you'll see if you participate either as a sensor operator only or as a sensor operator who also wants to have access to everyone else's sensor data is that everything that you're seeing is something that has happened in the last few seconds. This is actually a difficult technology problem, but it is one that we took on in 2007 and have become somewhat expert. So, I encourage you to reach out to any of the three founders. We're also on the web now at SIE-Europe.net if you want to find out how to reach us. And again, I want to point out, if the thing that you need is a database of what has been observed so that you can do lookups to find out, what happened in Europe, we will have that. So it's not mandatory that you drink from the real-time fire hose, which is, I guess, Twitter's name for their raw feed. It's just that we believe that that real-time fire hose must be available in order to facilitate real-time reactions to crime then in progress. So, we started a few minutes late. We're going to finish a few minutes late, I think, but let me open the floor to questions. This is a controversial topic. Somebody in the room ought to disagree with me about something.
I have a question. My question is that do you plan to have some kind of expiry date on the data you are collecting? Microphone, please.
We've been asked for a microphone over here. I'll repeat the question. Do we have an expiration date on the data that we're collecting? Yes. Whereas a normal database of DNS observations ought to go as far back in time as possible, this one's probably only going to go back a month or two. And it's a cost issue. This is a nonprofit activity. We can't afford to fund it bottomlessly. You, sir?
My question is about the sensor itself. Is it a network sensor or host agent?
The question is about the sensor. There are two sensors at the moment. It's software only, right? We're not in the hardware business. One of them operates as a BPF client, so it's very much like running TCP dump in the background at all times. And you can run that sensor on the name server itself. You can run it on an adjacent server that is able to witness the name server's traffic over a passive Ethernet tap, or perhaps even a span port on a switch if you have such a thing. And that sensor is fairly old. We've been doing it that way for years. And it just looks at the packets as they're going by and finds the ones that are upstream, not downstream, not customer oriented. And it looks for the packets representing a request, and then it looks for the packets representing the response, puts them all together in a package, and dumps that into the telemetry feed. It's open source, as I've said. The second sensor is one that is based on the DNS TAP interface, TAP, that was created by my staff a couple of years ago. And in this case, you don't need to reassemble the packets because the name server itself is able to gather the telemetry we want and put it directly into a telemetry feed, essentially in user mode. We think this is an improvement because now that it's in Unbound and it's in Bind and something very much like it is coming to PowerDNS, it becomes possible to make yourself a sensor with a simple configuration file change rather than having to install additional software or hardware or span ports or any of the rest of that. That is a very new piece of software that is probably just now being widely released in conjunction with the launch of SIE Europe. No, that's done.
May I have a follow-up question?
Follow-up question, yes, sir.
Because you are saying that it's observing the DNS traffic. So does it mean that the traffic, the data will be only tagged by the DNS traffic, or are there some secondary fields to identify the factors?
So the question is, are we collecting only DNS relevant traffic? And the answer is that at this time, yes. We have other channels in the United States that are not just DNS related. For example, we have malware signatures, we have spam, we have all kinds of things. But those don't qualify as sort of background activities. Those are threat focused. And we have a channel that is about, we call it the dark net, but that's often confused with the dark web, and I really don't mean Silk Road or anything like that, or Tor. What I mean is a network telescope. We have about 10 megabits a second of data that is being transmitted to IP address space that is reachable but is not used. And all we do is we collect all that traffic and put it on a channel. It is possible that once we succeed with our initial launch effort, which is DNS related, that we will add other channels, but we're pretty much going to be driven by the community. We will create a technical advisory committee of volunteers who are among our participants who will say, this is what's working well, this is working poorly, this is what we wish you would do next. So this whole thing will be governed by its own success. So until I've done one thing well, I don't want to promise you anything else.
Okay. And one more question, if I may. About participating in the program. Does it have to have some prerequisites? For example, the partner has to have a certain size, or any company can join?
Well, I think anyone can join, but if there are a couple of error conditions. The question was, are there prerequisites, or can any company join? We don't intend to exclude anyone by their nature. What we will do is negotiate with you as to what data you have, and of that data, what you're going to send to us. And if we can tell that you are sending us all the data you have, then even if it is small compared to, let's say, Deutsche Telekom, who has indicated an interest in participating here, we are all small compared to Deutsche Telekom. So we should not feel bad about not being of average size. But I will say that if what you're doing is sending us data only from a small office, home office, or from a laptop or whatever, then we're going to look at that and say, I'm sorry, that's not serious. We're looking for serious players. Now, that's not to say that as an academic researcher, someone might not be able to get access to this for research purposes. But we will be certainly asking the university in question to run a sensor. And since I'm collecting data from Technical University Delft and Unibo in Bologna, I know that at least two sets of lawyers have looked at what we're collecting and have said that the student privacy is being respected. And those two universities currently get access to my global products in exchange for running these sensors. So I don't want to discourage anyone from trying. Oop, I think I'm getting the hook. But I do want to just let you know we have to audit every participant because we don't want to expose the other participants to possible risks. If you're a criminal or if you're going to use it in some inappropriate way, perhaps leak it outside of Europe or what have you. So there will be There will be prerequisites, but no one should be turned away by fear of those prerequisites. Is there a question from anyone else before we close the session?